In this presentation, we will compare and contrast two of the emerging superpowers, India and China, to discover why they have much in common and yet their economies are different in many ways. The GDPs of both India and China grew significantly in the past 3 decades, but China's growth has been huge in comparison to India. In 1980, India's and China's GDPs were ranked 11th and 12th respectively. Since then, China has moved up 10 spots to number 2, while India has moved up only 1 spot to number 10. India and China have the fastest growing GDPs in the world, but they specialize in different sectors. China's output comes 28% more from industry, which includes the manufacturing sector. China is following the typical development path from agrarian to industrial to service-based economy. Meanwhile, though a large part of India is still agrarian, India has tried to leapfrog the Industrial Revolution by focusing primarily on the services sector, which includes information technology and all other economic activities that do not produce material goods. By focusing on processed goods exports, China has been able to dramatically improve its labor productivity since entering the WTO. India has also improved its economic output per worker, but high unemployment and the disparity between education levels of the lower and upper classes have limited India's ability to leverage its human capital. Since 2001, China's net exports have almost always remained positive, except for occasional dips due to the government easing pressure for the yuan to appreciate and fluctuations in demand from key export partners around the world, especially Europe. Meanwhile, India's net exports have remained consistently negative over the same period as the need to import goods and services outstrips what India can produce internally and export. One reason China has been able to improve its net exports so much compared to India is that it has created a relatively relaxed regulatory environment to facilitate trade. In order to better understand the differences in the country's economies, we must study their histories. Going back for millennia, India was famous for its many spices. At the turn of the 17th century, the Portuguese, British, French, and Dutch fought for the right to set up their own trading ports to gain access to India's spices. The British won and eventually colonized India in the 1600s. They used their power and resources to expand their colony throughout the subcontinent. India finally gained independence in 1947 and ousted the British. But the Brits left behind some advancements, including transportation with railways and canals, a hospital system with new sanitary standards, and the adoption of English throughout the country, which Indians used to enhance the country under their own rule. China was once a great seafaring nation. However, in the mid-1400s, the Ming dynasty arrogantly decided there was no need to explore outside of China's boundaries, shut out the Western world, and lost most of the economic benefits of trading with other countries. But the rest of the world, especially the British, did not agree. The Opium Wars of the 1800s led to the opening of ports in Shanghai and Guangzhou, as well as leasing Hong Kong to the UK. Soon after, other Western nations tried to get their share of the pie, much to China's dismay. Deng Xiaoping eventually opened the doors in 1978 and China rapidly industrialized. After achieving independence in 1947, India set up a democratic government. However, it drew heavily on the Soviet model for economic development, adopting 5-year plans. The 5-year plans in India are developed by a committee called the Planning Commission, which is led by the Prime Minister. Before the 1990s, the Indian government focused heavily on socialist policies. With this approach, 1, major decisions regarding the micro-policies of companies were controlled by the government. This led to a lot of bureaucracy and new businesses were not motivated to create wealth and jobs in the country. 2, India's government tried to fuel economic growth through large expenditures rather than increasing consumption or investment, forcing it to impose high taxes. And finally, 3, the rupee was pegged to the US dollar. This overvalued the currency, keeping imports cheap but preventing India from increasing exports and thus dampening economic growth. Combined, these policies led to the economic crisis of 1991. Sluggish growth of the tax base could not keep up with high expenditures of the government, leading to current accounts deficits. As investor confidence completely eroded, in mid-1991, India's exchange rate was subjected to a severe adjustment. To recover from the economic crisis, the Indian government opted for a huge IMF bailout loan, secured by the country's entire gold reserves. In June 1991, P.V. Rao took over as Prime Minister and he appointed the renowned economist Manmohan Singh as Finance Minister. The new administration reduced tariffs and interest rates, ended public monopolies, and allowed foreign direct investment in various sectors. Tariff liberalization reduced the cost of inputs and pressurized Indian industry to become more competitive. The 5-year plan socialist model that helped cause India's crisis in 1991 was also used by the Chinese Communist Party. However, China got a head start on India by reforming this model in 1978 and beginning to allow foreign investment and private ownership of business. Yet state-owned enterprises are still very politically influential entities and control the economy of China. SOEs dominate or have monopolies in key sectors such as energy and telecommunication. The cozy relationships SOEs have with government officials pose many obstacles to China's growth, so there is a constant struggle to rein in the excesses of SOEs. In the 1950s, China's financial industry was controlled by just one SOE bank, the People's Bank of China. But in 1978, the People's Bank of China became independent from the Ministry of Finance and 4 new specialized banks emerged. In 2001, China joined the WTO, gaining increased access to international markets. China has consistently ignored one of its key WTO commitments by keeping its currency fixed to US dollars. Undervaluing the yuan keeps Chinese production costs low and attracts global manufacturing. Communist Party of China leaders Li Jianan and Deng Xiaoping took charge in 1978 and led efforts to improve the economy that Mao's Cultural Revolution had degraded. These efforts included creating special economic zones along the coast where foreign investment and private enterprise were encouraged. These experiments proved more successful than anyone imagined and led to the consistent trend of broader economic liberalization. More recently, in response to the global recession in 2008, the Chinese government implemented a large economic stimulus package and an expansionary monetary policy which helped China rebound more quickly than most nations. Education is the foundation for any country's economic development. With that in mind, India aspires to offer its youth a world-class educational system. The Right to Education Act states that education is a fundamental right of every child aged 6 to 14. While the RTE has helped improve primary school enrollment to impressive levels, low high school graduation rates and college attendance remain a drag on India's services-based economy. Following the Soviets, China created an education system that consists of 6 years of elementary, 3 years of middle school, and 3 years of high school. As a result, China has been able to dramatically increase its primary school enrollment rates since the Cultural Revolution. Compared to the US, where education is more focused on the humanities, China and India focus more on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics-related subjects. When well-educated people apply their knowledge, they should be rewarded with an ownership interest in their innovations. Intellectual property law creates property rights in intangible products such as ideas through patents and trade secrets, works of art and expression through copyrights, and brands through trademarks. Therefore, a legal framework for protecting IP is necessary for a country to consistently profit for innovation. The countries that best protect the IP rights of their companies are able to export tens of billions of dollars worth of IP, while the countries that defy international norms of IP protection struggle to monetize and thereby incentivize innovation. This study, conducted by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, quantified the strength of each country's patent, copyright, trademark, and trade secret laws, as well as the enforcement of those laws. However, the scores are not weighted, so the critical category of enforcement counts just as much as every other category. As China aspires to not only manufacture the world's gadgets, but to move up the value chain by inventing and designing articles of manufacture, it makes sense that they have begun to develop relatively strong patent laws. India, on the other hand, still feels it can gain more by co-opting other countries' patents and then manufacturing the fruits of their labor at low cost, for example by making patented foreign drugs immediately available to their citizens in generic form. Note that India, which has robust entertainment and software industries, has jumped up from the bottom of the rankings in the copyright category. Meanwhile, China, which is notorious for making counterfeit goods, is down from its average ranking in the trademark category. China is dead last in protecting trade secrets because it forces foreign companies who wish to do business in China to share their secrets with domestic partners who are often SOEs. IP rights are only as strong as they are enforceable. Unless a country creates a system to identify and seize infringing products and services and force the infringers to pay the rightful IP owners, then even the strongest IP laws on the books are meaningless. China has begun to enact strong IP laws in order to foster domestic R&D and encourage foreign investment, but it is notoriously bad at enforcing those laws. Meanwhile, India inherited a robust legal system from the British colonists, which includes some legitimate IP enforcement mechanisms. Britain left many other legacies to the independent India, which it has built upon with varying degrees of success. Given its history and cultural heritage and the complexities of global markets, India has tremendous opportunities to improve its people's standard of living, and yet many challenges to overcome. India must follow through on the promise of its Right to Education Act to provide a world-class education to all of its citizens, not just the upper class. India should improve the financial literacy of its people so that they invest less in housing and gold and more in the debt and equity markets that fuel economic growth. India needs to update its IP laws for the 21st century to reflect the trends of globalization and technology. India should diversify its economy with an increased domestic manufacturing base. And all of the above initiatives will be less successful unless India stamps out corruption. China has an equally storied history and vibrant culture, and is currently even better poised to improve its citizens' standard of living in the coming decades. However, China also faces many of the same obstacles to sustainable economic growth as India, such as low graduation and college attendance rates and an overemphasis on STEM subjects. While China's manufacturing sector is exceptionally strong, China lags India in the all-important services sector. Meanwhile, boosting the manufacturing sector has led China to ignore its environmental impact. China should not continue to trade short-term economic gains for long-term damage to the resources that will enable future generations to thrive. As China aspires to move up the value chain, it must create mechanisms for both domestic and foreign companies to effectively police their IP rights. Finally, China must confront the corruption inherent in its one-party political system and SOEs, and allow innovative private companies to take a greater role in driving the engine of China's thriving economy. Given current trends, China's GDP will surpass the US by 2017. Extending these projections out to 2050, China and India will be the top two economies, with the US in third place. If the governments and citizens of each country recognize the issues we have raised and confront them head-on, these projections will underestimate how successful China and India can be in the first half of the 21st century.